Hello, everybody. Welcome to this week's episode of Water We Drinking. Today, we're joined by Nick Cotter, who is a water quality specialist and an environmental engineer. Thanks for joining us today, Nick.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you for having me. I'm excited.
Of course. Do you want to start us off by just telling us a little bit about what you do for work?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm pretty fresh into the industry still, about 8 months into working in environmental consulting. So I'm a staff engineer at Geosynthet Consultants, and primarily we deal with environmental projects ranging from small scope to large scope, uh, industrial clients. Basically, anytime a company has a need to address former contamination or current industrial discharge contamination. We go out, we do groundwater sampling, soil vapor sampling, basically just to get a gauge as to how dirty a site may be. And I'm kind of the boots on the ground position at the office. I'm in the field most of the time, traveling around. I'll drive at most maybe an hour to different sites, but I'm the legwork, and everyone in the office does all the reporting and the design stuff.
Nice.
Cool.
How
So oh, go ahead, Matt.
yeah. How important is it to do some sort of groundwater sampling when dealing with a commercial building or anything like that? Like, is it a pretty serious issue? Is it taken seriously? Or like what's kind of like the boots on the ground point of view looking in?
So yeah, and it varies a lot state to state. Here in Florida, and I was kind of surprised in my first few months learning about it. They take redevelopment quite seriously. So if a developer comes in and wants to put in an apartment complex on something that may be a former industrial site, or even like a new elementary school, things like that, there's normally part of that plan just to go out and do some baseline sampling. It's not too involved, just pop a few temporary wells into the ground, grab some groundwater, send it off to the lab for the analysis, and that can be a week or so turnaround. But there's more specialized cases in which the EPA or the FDEP has identified former contamination sites, and we'll do what's called a site assessment, phase one and phase two of a site assessment, and that really we delve into the history of the site, former proprietors who may be personally responsible for it, which is quite a rabbit hole to go down sometimes when everyone's pointing fingers at each other and all the worries are beneath your feet. It's pretty hard to pinpoint exactly where that came from. Uh, but it's definitely a crucial step for any municipality to continue commercializing and growing as a city.
So, do you have any specific examples of times where you've been at the work site where you've identified a hazardous material or some type of chemical that might be leaching into the groundwater?
Yeah, definitely. There's one of the biggest projects I'm associated with is what's called a hydraulic control system, which is basically we have 5 extraction wells just out along a surface water that's next to an ecological preserve, which the FDP takes a lot more seriously when there's contamination within that vicinity, and especially since it's a coal-fired power plant. Uh, they're they're under a lot more eyes and there's a lot more red tape involved there. And so basically, we have a system that's pulling groundwater out of the ground right at the edge of a riverbank, so it doesn't leach into the river. That eventually goes into a larger river that supplies a lot of commercialization, a lot of fishing. Basically, is a huge part of the economy here in Jacksonville, and so that's one of the key sites that I rotate on a lot. And there is another site that I go to once a month, uh, and basically we set up a pump and we have wells to recover what's called free product, which is basically just, if you can imagine, a layer of oil sitting on top of water. It's along that lines. But the free product in question is what's called creosote, which is what used to be used to treat railroad ties. And so a lot of times, in the early 1900s, late 1800s, there weren't exactly standards or specifications for how you store creosote or how you build a tank. And so after 50, 60 years, the stuff inevitably starts leaking into the ground. And when I'm pumping that stuff out into a big old 55-gallon drum, it is quite the smell, and you do not want to get it on you because it will not come out of anything. And over time, as stuff ages, it just gets nastier and nastier. And it's right along a little creek that again flows into the St. Johns River. So those are the two things right off the top of my head that come to mind.
Are you familiar with any of the like adverse health effects from the specific contaminants in which you're removing or dealing with every day? Or have you been warned about them or anything along those lines?
Yep. Yeah. So in consulting and especially in the field, we have to go through some pretty rigorous OSHA associated training. They call it the 40-hour HAZWOPER, and it's basically just a week long on site training that's entirely how to deal with hazardous materials. Uh, and I come with my environmental engineering background in college. We learned a lot about risk assessment and the hazards associated with each contaminant of concern. So a blanket statement would be to say a lot of them are cancer causing. Plenty of them can cause acute issues like lead and mercury, nervous system damage, and then a lot of the solvents or petroleum products can cause respiratory issues. And the list goes on, and PFOS has been the hot topic lately, and that one's, the more we study it, the more we realize it's pretty dang carcinogenic.
So do PFOS come up pretty regularly in your line of work, or is it still one of those contaminants that people aren't quite aware of yet that you might find in a job site, but nobody's really testing for it, or there aren't super strict standards on how much is allowed to be in an environment or in a certain site?
Yep. So yeah, and my education with it and work experience with it, I'm kind of right on the horizon. It's really been within the past few years that the EPA has started to lay out legislation regarding it, sort of incentivize researching it, incentivize cleaning it up, because the more we study it, the more we realize that it is very ubiquitous. The stuff is pretty much everywhere, and even at the most contaminants are monitored down to the parts per million or parts per billion level in water or soil. And we've already found PFOS can be harmful and cancer causing down to the parts per trillion level, which poses a lot of challenges analytically, sending samples to the lab and having them analyzed at a scale of 1,000 times smaller than what they traditionally analyze for is quite the task. It's cost intensive. My firm in particular has ruled out entire trainings specific to sampling for PFOS. We had to start changing up the equipment we use because some of the equipment we used may have had PFOS in it. I mean, they were using everything, like, like non-stick McDonald's wrappers, firefighting foams, a lot of the non-stick pans, basically any surface that you really didn't want to get wet or corroded. If you sold a product that you didn't want that you wanted to last a while, you were treating them with PFOS before selling them out.
And so what are the steps that your company takes once you do identify PFOS in a site? How do you remedy that situation and remove it?
Mm-hmm. So that's part of what we call the site assessment, and then that moves into the design phase. And it's highly dependent on whether it's been sitting there for a while. So if it's a recent, and even that could even be like past 5 years, if it's a recent spill or event or discovery, it's likely still pretty combined at the source and hasn't had the chance to sort of spread out through the environment and travel through the groundwater, which is one of the largest problems with PFOS is that they migrate a lot faster than other contaminants like lead, nitrate, arsenic, vanadium. It it flows pretty quickly. So if we catch it early, which is very rarely the case in environmental consulting, people point fingers for decades until we're able to take action and the legislation catches up. But typically, if we catch it early, it's a source removal, which is really expensive, but you just take an excavator out and dig it all up, test the soil around the area you dug and make sure you got all of it. And then if it moves into the groundwater, there's a lot of courses of action we can take. Sometimes a simple control is the only thing that's feasible cost-wise. So putting in some extraction wells, making sure we're not letting that water travel too far off site, especially if there's concerns with potable water treatment plants pulling in water anywhere near that. And there are some in situ, and in situ is just a fancy industry term for treating the contamination under our feet, where we can basically just inject some chemicals into the ground that oxidize or destroy the contamination, turn it into something that isn't nearly as harmful to human health.
Nice. How involved are like municipalities or the cities or whatever when you find these contaminants in the water? Do you have to run it past like the city or something, like inform them of the issue?
Mhm.
Do you or does your company deal with existing communities or schools or whatever that already have groundwater contamination? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing I've found fascinating about the consulting industry is that it is we're private based, obviously private backed, private equity, and we have a lot of our clients, like I was saying, are the municipalities, the power companies, but we also have a lot of private clients, and that could even be something small as someone who used to own a gas station, wants it cleaned up so they can sell. And in that case, there's uh, oftentimes the local municipalities aren't too involved with that unless we're doing some sort of work in a roadway or we have to check, we have to get surveys out to make sure we're not digging in or drilling holes through any sewer lines or power lines. And that kind of segues into one of the biggest projects I've been on was a private client, about a 50 or 60-year-old gas station. The gas station wasn't even there anymore. Just the concrete pad that was left in little places for the above ground storage tanks to hook into the ground. And so we went out and we thought we were just digging up soil that had petroleum all mixed in it. Little did we know there was 7 unregistered storage tanks, still probably 4 or 5 out of the 7 still full with leaded gasoline as we tested it once we found those. And that was very heavily involved with the city because uh, normally all tanks that are built underground, they have to be registered with the state or your local municipality. Obviously, before the Clean Water Act and RECRA, which was 60s and 70s, we weren't registering anything. So that's how we knew they were really old, was because they weren't entirely unregistered. And a lot of our private clients too are associated with what's called brownfield sites, which are basically those sites. If you're ever driving around a city and see construction fencing up around the same area for 5 or 6 years, it's because no one wants to redevelop there because it's really expensive because there may be former contamination. But there's a lot of tax incentives for doing so and cleaning up the area in the process. And so yeah, I would say uh, a lot of our work is private, but at this point, I would say it's a 50-50 split between private and public. So the municipalities are pretty involved.
So even if you're working with a private client and you identify a site that might have had a contaminant that leached into the groundwater or could potentially affect the city's drinking water, do you have to notify the municipality and let them know that there is an issue, or is it kind of up to the client to do that?
Yeah. So in the event, uh, basically, if there is going to be any real risk to the intake of a water treatment plant, that is normally notified right away. Uh, but in Florida, especially, it's more uncommon than you may think, because a lot of our water we get from 5 to 1,000 feet below our below where we stand. It's wells really deep down below land surface because a lot of saltwater intrusion just causes it to be hard to treat to get up to potable standards. But kind of circling back to PFOS, that's one of the main concerns and why it's been the hot contaminant in academia and industry and consulting as a whole, is because since it can travel really fast, it's only a matter of, could be months or years, that we'll be starting to see higher and higher levels of PFOS in these water treatment plants scattered around, and especially the older ones that aren't as updated, don't have as much cash flow moving through them. It's hard for them to adapt to new technologies that are able to treat PFOS, and so they'll really be behind the curve, and that's probably one of the main reasons that drives my particular company to be so heavily involved in PFOS. And I know that's kind of an industry standard right now for consulting as a whole.
Nice. What what like what kind of piqued your interest to pursue this line of work? Do you have like a personal experience, or are you just like to just fit your needs, or you talk a little bit about what pushed you down this path?
Yeah, absolutely. I always like to think it was kind of like a perfect storm midway through college. I came in as a chemical engineer with no real clue as to what I wanted to do. It's hard to have a tangible grasp on what your career may look like with bare minimum education. And so about sophomore year into college, I realized engineering wasn't for me. And I didn't instantly switch to environmental, but I always had been fond of the outdoors. My volunteer work in high school involved picking up trash at state parks and hiking trails. And I always loved waterfalls and things like that. And so I took a few environmental engineering classes that were just classified as general credit at that time, and they really piqued my interest. And even though they were focused on water treatment and wastewater treatment, that got me sort of into the environmental engineering realm. And so probably about a third of environmental engineers go into water, wastewater treatment. Another third, I would say, go into the more consulting realm, the remediation, cleaning up of contamination at the source. And then another third go into either litigation, environmental law, solid waste management, or environmental permitting for industrial companies. And so about senior year, when I knew that I wanted to go to grad school, I had to start narrowing it down. And I just really started to like my classes that dealt with the chemistry and the biology of what these contaminants do when they're in the ground, when they get into our systems, and kind of the health effects, how we can treat them, innovative ways to treat them. And that led me into my graduate research that was mainly focused on what we call bioremediation, which is basically letting the ground beneath our feet clean things up. And that involves there's native bacteria actually that have evolved since we've been polluting the ground to such an extent. These bacteria, which with such short lifespans, have evolved to be able to basically eat this contamination as their food and their source of energy. And so my particular research was involved with chlorinated solvents, and a particular strain, not to get too nerdy, was Dehalococoides, and it was pretty revolutionary when it was discovered because we didn't even know it was possible for the earth beneath our feet and Mother Nature to clean itself up without even our interference. And I've come to realize that now in the work field, we have numerous sites that the entire project basis now or monitoring plan is really just what's called natural attenuation, letting the earth clean itself up. And so we'll monitor it for 5 to 10 years based on a few parameters that we record at the start of the design phase. And so the only cost we take on is just going out there and sampling instead of setting up a remediation system, digging anything up and along those lines. And so I think it was really right about when I started to learn about that phenomenon that I really just wanted to spearhead into the industry and see how I could apply it.
That's super interesting. I actually hadn't even heard of that type of remediation. So that's I'm sure that'll be interesting for a lot of our listeners. You had told me briefly, Nick, a story about I think it was a chlorine compound that dry cleaners use. Can you tell that story to the rest of our listeners? Because I think they might find it interesting and gives them a little bit better of an understanding as to how some of these chemicals might end up in our drinking water or just the groundwater in general.
Yeah, absolutely. And so in this one, I probably told you the story before because I'm the most confident talking about it of all the contaminants. And so what's known as PCE or TCE in our industry in the late 1900s was regular old dry cleaning fluid. And so you dip your clothes in vats of these compounds, which is, if you're into chemistry at all, just two carbons with chlorines attached to them. And it was a really good solvent. And so it's like you can picture pouring out some isopropyl alcohol onto a table, it evaporates quickly. This stuff evaporates almost instantly when you pour it into a thin film. And so that's why it was good for dry cleaning and good for things like taking the paint off of old cars, old machines, and particularly airplanes, because that paint is kind of highly engineered to be able to withstand 20, 30,000 foot altitudes. And so these compounds, they used to just get dumped right out the back of dry cleaning sites because at the time we didn't know that they were particularly hazardous to human health. And now we know you can get direct exposure from inhalation, dermal absorption just through the skin, coming in contact with contaminated soil, or drinking the water. You are very likely to, you have a higher risk of kidney cancer in your lifetime, and particularly kidney cancer. And that biology side, I don't know nearly as well as the chemistry side. But now that is like the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, for example, the FDEP has an entire program within them that is for, it's what's called dry cleaning sites. There's certain protocol to follow. There's less alternatives to pursue cleaning up these chlorinated compounds, TCE and PCE, because we already know how to do it basically. So there's less choices. And some of them are pretty costly, but some of them involve exactly what I researched in grad school, which was that bioremediation. And we can kind of push that along and encourage the bacteria to break it down by injecting things into the ground, which may sound counterintuitive at first, just adding more chemicals to clean up other ones. But really, if you just pump a bunch of vegetable oil into the ground where these compounds were spilled at, time and time again, we have had success with cleaning up these compounds from soil vapor, from groundwater, and eliminating the risk to the ecological risk and the risk to human health.
Just a kind of a random thought that comes based off of that. Is there any, you kind of talked about like an organic way to filter, I guess, the soil or the ground in a sense. Is there any like applications that like any person at home could take to like clean the soil that they use in their gardens or for farmers? Like, can you speak of any like organic filtration methods, I guess?
I know, and it might kind of be adversely answering your question or kind of off your intent there, but I know composting is a great way to basically let the biological processes that are already going on to kind of bolster that and let them come to equilibrium, as you'd say. And other than that, I know there are, if we're going out to treat soil that's heavily contaminated, we do throw on some chemicals that could be hazardous if we add too much, but you just, based on the concentrations, we kind of add just enough to break down what we need. But yeah, sort of at home, I would just say composting is a great way, mixing in the soil you already have, amending it with, say, food waste. They have lots of composters out now that some of them don't even stink up your home. Some of them you can use worms, which may gross some people out, but I think it's fascinating. So,
And and then I guess a quick follow up to that that you may or may not know is, do you know from your experience, is there a certain depth at which contaminants actually become an issue? Like, is someone gardening in their backyard really going to be affected by contaminants as opposed to like a construction site where they're digging, much further into the ground?
yeah, so I would say uh, very much so for the large for most people, you aren't going to be concerned with soil contamination. It's a lot of times it's obvious. The soil will be discolored, it'll be dead. You won't be able to grow things there in the first place. And there's a select few exceptions to that, but for the vast majority of cases, a lot of the unless it's apparent, like just to our eyes or even your nose, you can smell a lot of these compounds if they're on the surface. a lot of the concern lies deeper beneath the ground, like 10, 20, 30, 40 feet. And that varies a lot state to state too. Uh, here in Florida, it's a lot different under our feet than it is up in Montana. Uh, so there's a lot of different considerations to take, and there's entire different methods for treating things and assessing things, doing the phase one site assessments. There's a lot of different routes to take depending where you are geographically.
Um, so I have another kind of random question. You mentioned that for your job you dig test wells. Um,
Mhm.
Roughly how deep are those test wells? And if you know, I'm not sure if you do, how deep is the average well that someone might have at home for their own drinking water? And if they're
Yeah.
comparable, is there any um, is there any potential for some of these contaminants to reach the depths that someone's personal well would be at?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, kind of circling back to how soon you catch the contamination. Uh, we have a lot of shallow wells that are just 10 to 20 feet below the surface. Uh, and the as deep as I've seen in Florida is about 120 feet. When you get further from the coast, that's about as deep as I've seen them be drilled, though. Uh, but I know I'm not too sure here in Florida. I know back home in Pennsylvania, a lot of people in the rural areas get their water straight from wells and not from a municipality. And in those areas, especially, uh, those wells, those aquifers they can be as shallow as 100 foot deep. And you can do some simple back of the envelope calculations using really well established theories that say it only takes a few years for some contaminants to get to that depth. And so there's definitely a large concern, uh, especially in rural areas, because it's often not reported as well. Any potential contamination. It's hard for the government to be looking in the middle of the woods where people are getting their drinking water from, but it's equally as possible for those wells to be contaminated with all the things that we've already mentioned.
Yeah, well, thanks for clarifying that because I think it's a kind of a common misconception that if you're on well water, there's less reason to filter your water or be concerned about any type of contaminants that you might be drinking. So I think if you are on a well, this is your friendly reminder to continue filtering your water because
Yeah.
you never know what chemicals might have flowed downstream or somehow ended up in the groundwater.
Yeah, and you don't know. That's just the thing. There's no way for you to know unless you send some samples to a lab, which is thousands of dollars to analyze for everything that could potentially be harmful.
Yeah.
And and so yeah, I think people really start to uh they start to act fast when they or when someone proposes, oh, you can have well water. There's still even naturally occurring things that you don't want to be drinking on a daily basis, just for the amount that you'd be consuming once or twice, probably not bad. But when you're talking about getting your water 10 years from a well that you don't even know what's down there, it can go down a not so good path pretty quick.
Yeah, the last thing you need is an old lead gas tank from down the street
Yeah.
at the old gas station leaking into your well water. So,
Yep.
um, yeah, better to be safe than sorry.
And then on that topic as well, I believe Rob mentioned you had done some research on the East Palestine like train derailment. Is that correct?
Mhm. I did. Yeah, there was one of my environmental organic chemistry classes that I took uh, in graduate school. Uh, First, the project was just to write a proposal, which is basically just a proposal for a research project to get money. And then that happened very, very early last year. So we kind of twisted course really quick, and my professor said, "Hey, do you guys want to do a presentation on this instead?" And I jumped all over it, being from only about 3 hours from where that happened, up in Pennsylvania is my hometown. I jumped all over the opportunity, and he was able to get us that data from the consulting firms that responded to it immediately. Our firm is currently monitoring it, and we're involved with the well network up there. But without any experience in the industry, we researched it for about a semester, and I'm not too sure how far you want me to delve into that. But basically, our presentation was titled "Where Did It All Go?" Trying to figure out where the heck over 30 tons of vinyl chloride went to in the months following that derailment.
Yeah, and Nick, I know you and I discussed it a little bit previously, but we talked about the vinyl chloride that did end up in some of the streams and
Mm-hmm.
that was on the surface level. And could you tell our listeners how um, you would
Uh,
remove that from the environment when it's not mixed into the soil and it's just kind of on the surface of a stream or something like that?
yeah, absolutely. So to tell the whole story, essentially, a few train cars derail, and they spill out vinyl chloride, which is used to make PVC, polyvinyl chloride piping that everyone knows, and somehow that process just turns it non-carcinogenic, even though vinyl chloride is nasty for human health, especially acutely. It displaces oxygen really quick in your system, can make you pass out, and it doesn't smell. It's odorless, so a huge concern to even be around it. And so a lot of it, when it was just sitting there next to the railroad tracks, like anything, just like water, it's going to flow to the lowest elevation possible. And there were two creeks nearby that site where there was visible sheens of vinyl chloride on top of the water. And so what they do is set up what's called just basic booms. Basically, you can think of it as big pillows that you put on top of the water, so that the vinyl chloride, which floats on top, just basically gets absorbed into those booms. And obviously, a lot of it is still dissolved in the water. And so there were two pump and treat systems that were pumping water out of those creeks into big tanks, and they would flow it down through beds of activated carbon, and then they would just pump it right back out into the stream. And in that case, and for vinyl chloride is a class of contaminants called VOCs, or volatile organic compounds. That is one thing that activated carbon has shown for decades in research and in literature and in industry to be one of the most effective ways to basically pull VOCs from water.
Absolutely. And as a company that uses activated carbon filters in most of our products, I'm not sure how much you know, but are you able to talk about the filtration process and why it's so effective?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll really get into the weeds on this one too, because it is something I researched in undergraduate. Uh, so basically, you can think of activated carbon as really tiny little sponges, whether it be powdered or granular. It comes in different forms, as people may see in their home filtration systems. And so you can just think of it as those sponges are soaking up contamination, and water is so small and ubiquitous that it doesn't stick to the sponge. It gets absorbed, but if you get a sponge super wet, water is going to keep passing right on through it. And so it's a similar concept there with activated carbon. The contaminants that have different chemistry than the water are going to want to stick to that activated carbon. And so where my research came into play was, how can we not just chop down trees to make activated carbon or use unsustainable forms? And two or three of the things that we looked at was using basically byproducts from the animal rendering industry. So chicken or feather meal, pulling all the feathers off of chickens uh, for commercial sale. You can take all those feathers, throw them in a furnace, really high heat, and it undergoes what's known as pyrolysis. And it turns it into basically just a black soot that is activated carbon that has all those tiny little pores that you want the bad contaminants to stick into. And there's other things like soybean stalks, coconut husks, which I think you guys are familiar with.
Yep, that's
That are
actually what we use to make our activated carbon is coconut, and we use solid carbon blocks for most of our filters.
yeah, that's another way it can come too, which is easier to transport, easier to deal with, easier to replace, and equally as effective at small and large scale.
Yep. Um, awesome. Well, yeah, thanks for giving us a little bit more insight into the chemistry of how activated carbon filters out contaminants, because I know for
Yeah,
most people
absolutely.
it's a little bit of a confusing topic.
Yeah, it could be a black box when you're passing water through something that looks, that dark. Just
Hmm.
the appearance of it, I'm sure, makes people timid, but it's used in, and I pulling just pulling a number out of thin air here, but I would confidently say at least half of all drinking water treatment plants at some stage in their process use activated carbon. And it's really hard for them to maintain those systems. The activated carbon either can be regenerated, which you kind of lose some of the mass of it when you do that, basically just heating it off, driving all the contaminants off, or they can just replace it altogether, which is super expensive. So uh, a lot of the municipalities and the drinking water treatment plants that aren't necessarily as up to date or in the 21st century, they don't replace those often enough. And so having a second polishing step is 100% a great idea in that situation, especially if you aren't in a very urban area.
Absolutely. And I guess we're kind of getting towards the end of our time here, but I guess in a nutshell, how could you wrap up the importance of filtering your water through your personal firsthand experience dealing with all these harmful contaminants? And I don't know, just kind of give us a closing statement, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things that shocks me most about this industry is just how little we know. I mean, we set the levels of all these different chemicals that can be in the water because at the end of the day, it would cost millions and billions and trillions of dollars to completely remove all of these things from water. And whenever you're getting down to, like I was talking about, that parts per trillion level with PFOS, when you get to that point, it's just not feasible to treat it anymore past the parts per trillion level. So we have regulations that acknowledge both feasibility of treatment, and we aren't able to strongly say how much they impact our health. We use animal studies and extrapolate that data to the human biology, which cannot be accurate at all. I mean, it's effective for legislation, but in terms of precision and statistical significance, it's really hard to make that extrapolation. And so basically, we can't confidently say uh, that our drinking water isn't hurting us because there's no data to support it. And so it really just ties in nicely there. A peace of mind is very much worth it at the end of the day. And when it's as simple as just uh, using a certain water bottle, it's really no question.
I guess another uh, question I have that I just thought of is how much do you know about like ocean water, and does that contaminate or does that affect the groundwater around it, or is ocean water equally as affected as fresh water?
Okay, yeah. Uh, so ocean water, I guess in terms of treatment, in terms of contamination, uh, it's even though it's by far the largest of our water supplies, it likely doesn't have, and I don't have much of a background in marine ecosystems as much as subterranean or hydrogeological settings. But I'm sure it is probably at this point quite an easy passage for some industries just to say, hey, throw it in the ocean. There's so much of it that it'll dilute and it won't be a concern. And then treating that ocean water is extremely expensive just due to the salt content. You have to really pump that stuff at really high pressures through some really, really tiny membranes to remove everything, especially the salt that's in it that no one wants to drink. That's super expensive. But I'm sure within the coming years, with concerns of global warming and icebergs melting and all of that, there will be more eyes turned toward our marine ecosystems and uh, what could happen if our kids are playing in ocean water and we don't know what's in it.
Absolutely.
Great point.
I guess
Well,
the last closing question.
yeah, so we have one final question we ask all of our guests that we have on the podcast. But that question is, have you ever had an experience where you've drank unfiltered water and it has made you sick?
uh, I definitely have. I know, I'm sure all of us growing up as kids, if you're even in the urban areas, we all like to go play in a creek, go fishing in a lake, go jump in a lake. And particularly one time I was tubing at the local lake that we had in my hometown. Went face first right off the tube, swallowed a mouthful of water. And we had swam in a good bit, so I figured, oh, I wouldn't get sick. But when I thought about, oh, I just drank a good bit of that. It was right before the 4th of July, and I spent the 4th of July laying on my couch, miserable and even for several days after that. And it only took that one time. I can't recall many other times where I drank lake water. So that's
Wow.
probably the hallmark.
Just one sip of water and that's all it takes.
That's all it took. That was one of the sickest I've ever been to.
Sorry, another closing question I was thinking of, Rob, was what's
Absolutely.
what's one thing you would tell a younger version of yourself today?
Oh my.
Super off topic,
That's
but
that's getting
yeah,
broad. No, I like it.
ask a
Um,
question.
I would say to be more open-minded to these sorts of things. To try and be more aware of the world around you and more aware of your surroundings in general, and that can be applied to so many different little niche topics or so many aspects of life. But in general, approaching things with an open mind and being open to new ideas and opportunities is something I wish I would have been better at growing up. But it's all part of the process.
Absolutely. If we had like-minded individuals, I think maybe a lot of these environmental concerns, wouldn't be an issue if we all had these thoughts from a young age and brought that into legislation,
Exactly.
politics.
Exactly.
That's a different
Yeah.
wormhole. But
Yeah.
Yep.
That'd be another podcast because I could start rambling and rambling
Yeah.
about the public not accepting things and all the issues that could be solved, but for another day.
Yep. Well, thanks so much for joining us, Nick. This was very informative, and I hope our listeners feel the same way. I personally learned a lot about a few of the different contaminants that you've worked with and just the overall process of what goes into cleaning up a contaminated site. So thank you for sharing everything and stay epic.
yeah, your knowledge was extremely helpful. And I guess in a nutshell, we tell everyone to just filter your water and make sure it's with an Epic water filter.
Hey, I've got mine right here.
Awesome.
Thank you guys so much for having me, though. As you can tell, I could just ramble and ramble about this sort of thing. And so it was great to have an outlet to be able to let that out a little bit. So I really appreciate you guys. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah,
Yeah, no
absolutely.
problem.
Sweet. Thank you.
Thank you.